Okay, so what happens if I log into my application and I create a new post? And what if I just leave everything blank and hit create post? Okay, so this doesn't look good. I can see in my console on the right side that we have this interesting route not found error. I do see that in my archives list on the sidebar here that we've added our February 2018 post, so maybe I'll just click there. And okay, I've got this empty post, and I can try to click view post. Again, route not found post. Well, so I've got a couple pretty big issues going on here. The biggest issue is that my backend is not doing a very good job at kicking back an error when I try to give it a bad input. So you would probably expect any blog post to have a title, and you'd probably expect it to have a body. And so as developers, we cannot rely on the input from the front end, no matter how much front end logic you might have. We cannot rely on that input at all. So really, my backend is not secure. That's the biggest problem. But as front end developers and using Aurelia, we can still do a little work and trying to prevent even sending data that we know will not be good to the backend in the first place. So that's what this video is going to be about. In this video, we are going to do some validation using the Aurelia validation plugin. And what we're going to do is basically try to prevent data that we know is bad from even being sent to the backend in the first place. So as I mentioned, I called this the Aurelia validation plugin because it is indeed a plugin, and we have not really encountered plugins quite yet, but these are pretty important to Aurelia. In fact, they're really important. And basically, a plugin is something that has can basically have a much closer connection to Aurelia. Basically, you can run some code during Aurelia's startup. It happens before anything is rendered, and you can configure Aurelia in a lot of ways using plugins. Some things that can happen are, for example, registering services in the dependency injection container. You can customize Aurelia configuration. You can do a whole lot of things. And so we are going to use validation as a plugin today, but some things that we've already touched on that can also be plugins are things like the value converter, the Aurelia router, and the Aurelia event aggregator. So just know that we could have been using plugins all along, but we will just use the form validation as a great example. So what I'm going to do is I will go to my console, and here I will install the Aurelia validation package, and I'll use AU install to streamline this. So I'll do AU install Aurelia-validation, and also add a little save flag here so it puts it in my package.json. And as we recall, this is going to use npm to install, and then it is going to throw this dependency into our Aurelia.json file. So it'll take care of a number of things for us here. Okay, great. That has been done. So one thing we'll notice is that we did that. Nothing actually happened on the left side of here, so we will want to terminate that, and then we can run AU run watch again, and now it will actually bundle with that new dependency. So let's go ahead and launch our code editor. And within our code editor, to actually use a plugin, what we need to do is open our source folder, go into our main.js, and we haven't explored this file too much, but this is where you can register plugins. Actually, you probably didn't know this, but you actually have this Aurelia testing plugin that is actually being registered here. So we don't actually want to make this Aurelia validation plugin conditional on what the environment is. We want this to exist no matter what. So we can actually just chain it here within the Aurelia.use. We're using this standard configuration in this feature method. So let's just add a plugin method here and say we would like to use the Aurelia validation plugin. Great. So what we've done here is now we've registered with our app and said, okay, we're going to need to use this Aurelia validation package as a plugin. So the next thing we'll want to do is think about where we actually want to use our validation. And if I go back to my application, I can go to login. And well, so if I do a new post, yeah, I'll probably want to do some validation here to make sure the title is complete and the body is complete. Maybe I'll have a minimum number of characters. Maybe it'll just be, hey, you've got to have at least something here. So I want that. But also, if I go home and I go to my second post here, since I'm logged in as Jane Doe, if I hit edit, well, I'll still want it to validate here because I wouldn't want to be able to take the entire title out and save that, because that could also cause issues. So we know then that what we're going to be doing is adding our validation just to this form custom element that we created in the previous video. So let's go back to our code. It's open resources, elements, and let's open our postform.js and our postform.html. We can close our main.js because we have registered our plugin there. And so what we'll want to do is first let's go ahead and import a couple things that we know we're going to need within our view model here. So we are going to want to import. One thing that we will need is the validation rules object, and I will show you how to use that. And then another thing we know we're going to need is, so we need something called a validation controller. And this is going to help us access the errors from validation rules. And it's also going to help us do things like trigger the actual validation action so that we can validate the input, and we can kind of have more control over when that happens. But so what is the right thing to do in this case is we are not going to want to use dependency injection to pass around a controller between different parts of the application, because we really should have this controller being unique to each instance of whatever we want to validate. So we have two options here. We could actually go through something that would basically use dependency injection and inject a new instance of a validation controller. Or what we could do, which I'll do here, is just inject a validation controller factory. And then whenever we use the validation controller factory, what we do is we basically create a validation controller every time we need it. And I'll do that now. It's actually pretty simple, and I'll show you how that goes. So that being said, what we need is the validation controller factory. And both of these are coming from the Aurelia validation package that we just installed. Great. So we need to inject the validation controller factory. So we've got our validation controller factory. Let's additionally use it in our constructor. And so we want to create a validation controller. So we can just say this.controller equals validation controller factory, but we don't want it to equal the factory. What we need to do is actually create a validation controller. So we can say create for current scope, and that will scope our new controller correctly. It'll create one and scope it correctly. So now we actually have a validation controller. Okay, great. So we may then want to create some validation rules. Naively, I might say, well, let's create our validation rules in the constructor here. Maybe I'll say validation rules. And what I can do is I can say, for example, ensure that the title is required. But importantly, I don't actually just want to ensure that the title is required. I need to ensure that it's required on something. So I can say on this.post. And normally establishing a rule like that, saying that we need to make sure the title of this .post is required, would be fine. With custom elements, it can be a little tricky where you do that. You don't necessarily have the post yet. This is due to the asynchronicity of the application. So wherever this element's being used, if the post doesn't exist yet, you might get an error saying, well, I don't know what this .post is, and so I can't assign these validation rules quite yet. So one thing we can do to make sure that this works well is we kind of skimmed over this method that is always available when we create a new custom element, which is this value change method. In this case, we could actually call this more appropriately post change. So every time the post is changed, then we can make sure these validation rules get assigned. And importantly, if we want to be careful, we can say if this.post. So just to make sure that the post actually does indeed exist. Okay, then we can say, yeah, if there's a post, then let's ensure that the title of that post is required. So hopefully that makes some sense. I know it can be a little bit confusing, but that is the way we assign validation rules in a very, very basic sense. So what I'll also want to do now that we've done that is go to my post form, and what I'll want to say is right now I am binding the value post.title here. Well, I also need to tell it that, hey, this is what we are going to do our validation based off of, and this will, sorry, that should be validate. So this will actually tell it, hey, we're going to validate based on the entry in this input field. Okay, so that's quite a bit. Let's actually go to our application and see what's going on. So I'm going to log in as Jane Doe, and I'll create a new post. Okay, so nothing's actually happening, and perhaps I'll try what I did before and create a post. Okay, let's check our console. It still has the same error. I can still go, it's the exact same behavior that we saw before, so that's no good. Okay, so what can we do now? Let's think about what we actually are trying to get out of this validation here. Well, what we're actually trying to do here is we want to make sure that we are perhaps displaying any validation errors, and maybe we'd even want to disable the submit button if our validation rules detect that something's amiss. So one thing we can do is first let's try to conditionally display some validation errors. So we can do this in a list, but of course there's a lot of ways you could do this. So I'm going to create an unordered list here, and we'll just do a list item. And what I'll say for this unordered list is if bind. So this list will only appear if controller, and again that controller is our validation controller, if controller.errors is greater than 0. Sorry, I should say if controller.errors.length is greater than 0. So basically what this is saying is if there are a non-zero number of controller errors, then we need to show this list. Okay, so what do I want to do? Well, maybe I want to iterate through each of these controller errors and display them. So in this list item, I can say repeat for error of controller errors. And then, yeah, let's just use a template literal to display the error. All right, so this might work a little better. Let's go back to our application, and I'm going to log in again as Jane Doe. Okay, and I'll click new post. And so if I type something here, well, yeah, it's required, so we're looking good. But what if I take all of this out? So I took everything out of there, and then once I blurred, or once I went out of this field, look what we have down here. We have a note that our title is required. Okay, so that's feeling like a good sign. Well, what else could we do with that? We mentioned not allowing for the creation of posts in this event. So perhaps we could use this same logic except what we'll say here is within our button, and I'll just space this out a little more appropriately. We'll say disabled.bind, and this will be basically the same thing that we use here. So if controller.errors.length is greater than 0, then we will make sure that this button is disabled. All right, let's go back to our application. Let's try this again. So yeah, the button's enabled, no problem. But if I take this title out and then I go to the next field, okay, create post is now disabled because I have not met our criteria here. So that's a really good sign. We're getting there, but you know, again, if I refresh the page, well, my title is empty now, so why would it allow me to still create the post? So I don't know if you recall me saying it, but one thing we can do is use our validation controller to manually trigger our validation. So if I go back into our view model and say, all right, after we assign this validation rule, yeah, let's go ahead and just apply it. So maybe here I'll say this.controller and use our validation controller, and I'll just say, hey, let's validate immediately. So I'll save that, go back to our application, and here we go. So I've reloaded the page, and immediately we notice that title is required. I can't create this post. That's awesome. So, but if we keep playing with this, form, maybe I'll say test title, and then I'll scroll down and say, well, I've added my title. Why can't I create the post? And that's because the default functionality here is for Aurelia to validate once the focus is off of this field. So if I tab, yeah, now we've passed our validation. So we can actually pretty easily change that. Like with pretty much anything in Aurelia, there's a ton of customization that can be done. If I go back to my view, my post form view, currently we said post.title and validate. Well, we can say validate on change rather than validating on blur from the field. So go back to our application and I'll just type a letter. Hey, okay, that's perfect. So now my title is F. It immediately knows that I'm allowed to create a post, or if I delete that, it immediately knows that I'm not allowed to create a post. That's great. So there are tons of options with validation. I'm going to show you how to do a little more customization with our validations, but just know that the Aurelia docs will give you a ton more options. So let's think about maybe validating the body for the same purpose. So I will go here and say, well, and let me just make this a little cleaner. So maybe I also want to say that the body is required. Let's copy this and just say, all right, the body needs to be required. Great, but of course we have to remember to go back over to our view and again use this and validate on change to tell Aurelia that we are looking to explicitly validate the body property that's being binded to this text area. Great, so let's go back to our application. And all right, so we've got a list here. Title is required, body is required. If I start typing my title, then I see, oh, body is still required. I can't create my post yet. So I start typing in my body. Ah, okay, so as soon as I start typing there, the body is required. Great, that's exactly what we want. What if we want this error message to display differently for some reason? So perhaps we want it to say, you must enter a title, for example. Well, we can say pretty easily, just with message, something like, you must enter a title. And we can also do that for body and say, you must enter a body. And we'll go back to our application. And sure enough, that works. So that's pretty cool. But it's also a little redundant, right? So this is the same type of thing. And we're saying that, okay, if it's required, you have to enter a title. If it's required, you must enter a body. Well, if we had like a bunch of these, if we had many fields, what are we going to repeat this text over and over again? That would be really inefficient and not great, especially if we wanted to change that message sometime in the future. So there is an easier way. What we can do is bring in something called the validation messages object. And so we can just import that here as well. And so importing validation messages, now all we have to do is perhaps here we'll say our validation messages for the required method. So if an item is required, then we want it to display some sort of text like, maybe it's going to be title. You must enter a title. Or it would say you must enter a body. But so we need some way to kind of make this variable. Well, one way we could do that is I'm going to take this with message away here and this with message away here as well. We can give each of these properties a display name. So our display name will be title for here, and our display name will be body. And so here, what we can do here is instead of actually writing out what it is that must be entered, we can basically use variable. And so we can say you must enter a display name. And we are escaping this because it doesn't exist at the time that this is being set, but it will be rendered with the correct display name as specified here. So, one more thing I want to do is just use these ticks. And one more thing I want to fix is this should be validation messages. And so if I go back to my application, I now see, oh, you must enter a title, you must enter a body. I've now refactored this a little bit to not be so redundant, and I can just include my message there. So there are all sorts of things that you can kind of ensure. So you can also perhaps you would want to ensure that the display name is also has some minimum length. You may also want to ensure that the title has some minimum length. Maybe it needs to be at least 5 characters, so we can do that. So let's go back to our application. And okay, we see it says you must enter a title. So if I start entering a title, okay, so now we get the next message. So if I take that away, well, yeah, this you must enter a title, that supersedes it. So if I start typing, now we know that our title must be at least 5 characters, so we're still not there. And again, I can this is the body, and yeah, I'm still having this issue where my title is too short. So yeah, this is pretty good. So again, this is I'll show one more example of trying this when we're editing a post. So view this, edit post, and again, it looks good now. But if I delete this title, yes, perfect. So what we've basically done here is we've taken our front end approach of making sure that we validate our form input. As I mentioned at the beginning, front end validation is extremely important from a user experience perspective. It's also really good not to send bad data to your backend, but as we know, there is no front end that can't be circumvented if you have someone motivated enough. So please do always make sure that your backend is validating and kicking out bad data. But at least we can be comfortable that people who are using our system in the intended way will see some nice validation messages and not be able to necessarily do actions that we don't want them to.